Hello all, Mr. MP here. Today we're going to be talking about the Russian Revolution. You'll want to open up your notebook, which you have shared with me in the past. If you go into your Google Drive and search notebook, it should pop up. You'll want to make sure that you put the date at the top, which is 5/5/20 or Cinco de Mayo. You'll also want to make sure that you put a title, Russian Revolution, and make sure that you're putting this at the top of your notebook, not further down where I won't be able to find it. You're going to want the most recent to be at the top always when you're entering things in your notebook. All right, so today we're going to talk about the Russian Revolution, but before we do that, we have to know some basic economics. And one of the more basic concepts of economics is the four factors of production. So you're going to want to type and then define the four factors in your notebook that are listed here. Factor one is labor. Anything that you have, any business, is going to require labor. There are going to be people who have to do things. People are going to have to pick fruit. People are going to have to teach classes. Even if you have something that's highly mechanized, like making a car, there are people who run the safety tests. There are scientists who design the machines. You're always going to need laborers to do work. The second thing you have, factor two, is called land. It's not exactly the definition of land where it's just territory. It's also resources. So if you're making cars, you're going to need to have metals, you're going to need to have rubbers, you're going to need to have land to put a factory on. If you're doing agriculture, you're going to need land, you're going to need water, you're going to need sunlight, you're going to need a number of factors. So number two is more accurately resources. Factor three is capital. So capital is basically money. It's like investing in your business. No matter what your business is, at some point you're going to need to invest some money into it. So in this one, which is a farm, you have this guy on the tractor here who is going to be, that tractor is what's called capital. You have to invest in that in order to be able to haul your produce to market, in order to be able to pick it, in order to be able to do anything that you need capital. Now that capital is held by the person with the fourth factor, which is entrepreneurship. So entrepreneurship is that person or set of people who are pushing the business, who are investing in it, who are putting their capital to get land, to get labor, to pick a product, to figure out how they're going to market that product and send it to market. So that's basically how all businesses work. No matter what political system or economic system you're under, you're always going to need labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. Okay, so we got to think about it, first of all, in the 1800s. Capitalism had some problems with many of these factors. So first of all, land. Land was mainly owned by the rich. We've seen that throughout our study of history, whether it's in France or wherever, that kings, nobles, the middle class, they own all of the land. And so it's a very few group of people who own resources that are pretty defined. There isn't more land generally than is being used by the time we get to the 1800s. So it's not like back in the day where you could go off and just find new land to use and start your own thing. If you were someone who was fairly poor, the land started being dominated by one group of people. And that group of people are also the only people who have the capital to be able to start enterprises, to run businesses. So the rich are controlling the land, they're controlling the capital. Now, one of the other problems is that labor has not much it can do because labor is super plentiful. So we talked about during the Industrial Revolution that when you guys did your scientific projects where you looked at a very specific scientific development, many of them had to do with agriculture. They helped people collect goods better. It helped them grow goods better. So this meant that you needed fewer and fewer peasants to make the food necessary to run the country. So those peasants have to go somewhere. If they're not going to be working in rural areas, they're going to move into urban areas. So starting in the 1800s, in a lot of countries, you get peasants pouring into these cities, and they're going to work somewhere, and what they're going to start working for are these enterprises. Now, because there's so many of them, entrepreneurs don't have to pay them very well. They don't have to give them good places to live because there's always someone else who will step in. If I'm running a business and I need 3 of you to work, and there's no other businesses that you guys can join, I'm going to be able to get you guys for very cheap, for whoever is willing to work for the cheapest, whoever is willing to eat the worst food, live in the worst place, that's the person who's going to work for me. And since I'm trying to maximize my profits, because I'm this entrepreneur who's trying to grow my business, I'm likely to continue doing that. Which is going to create problems because many of the other people in the class who are now not working are going to be upset. And even the people who are working are going to be upset because they're working in terrible conditions and I'm driving around on my sweet tractor.
All right, so capitalism has some problems in the 1800s, and some people start to notice that. Um, One of the things that makes this very, very noticeable is the terrible conditions that the poor live in. So these are pictures from Russia of what are called tenements. So basically, if you have a factory and you need a bunch of people to work in it, you need them to live, and you preferably nearby. So they would put up or convert these kind of brick buildings that were in terrible shape, that weren't a lot of money put into making them nice, and pack people in. So you can see in this picture on the left, this one guy's living above this other guy in a tiny little alcove. It can't be very fun to be the guy on the bottom or the top. You've got a stove here, which doesn't look particularly nice or particularly safe. There's cloth all over it. It looks fairly dirty and dusty. You have over here, this guy's living in a similar area. And then up top, you even see that even when buildings get too full, they would build out wood structures off of them. So this is a fairly terrible place to live. It's also very dangerous. People are not having electricity, so they're living with lanterns, and all it takes is someone knocking that over. People often drank because life was so terrible, so you have people stumbling around, knocking over lanterns, starting huge fires that burn up buildings and destroy workers, which doesn't bother the entrepreneur too much because he can always find someone else to jump in and do this. So this guy Karl Marx, who's a guy you may have heard of, is someone who noticed this. Now, he has kind of a bad rap because Marxism gets tied in with communism and socialism, which are things that have generally caused a lot of damage over the 20th century and into the 21st. But when you look back at what he was writing about, he's really a smart guy. So Marx and this guy Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto. And what they did is they were really historians in a lot of ways, and they looked at the history of economics. And it's really, in some ways, the story of what we've talked about this entire year. So they looked back in time and said in the beginning they had tribalism, which is another word for hunter-gatherers. So you have those tribes kind of unorganized, wandering around, living off the land. But they then identified that the first conflict happened when people started organizing, when you started getting agriculture. And what they called that was class conflict. We think of classes today as the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class, and that's fairly close to how they saw it. They saw the people on top, then the people in the middle, the people on the bottom. And so what they said is you started to have kind of a two-tiered system, where there were the patrician agriculture people who started the first agriculture and started having lots of land and growing crops and founding cities and villages. And these people depended on slavery in order to do their thing because agriculture is very intensive. So you had this conflict that was solved as patricians formed a system of government that used slavery to support their businesses. But that became a problem because then there's conflict. People who don't like being slaves, it's not a great way to live. So you get your second class conflict, which is when they have what they called plebeians, which is basically slaves, started feeling upset that people didn't like that there were just a few people in charge. And so you started to get aristocrats. You started to get a group of people underneath a king who also wanted to have access to land. And that's where you get feudalism, where we had that structure with the king at the top, and then you had your nobles, and then you had your merchants, and then you had your peasants. And so that's how they solve that conflict, is you start to get this structured society. But even that doesn't last forever because, as Marx is saying, there's always going to be people who get upset. And so he says after feudalism, there was the bourgeois, which is a word I might want to write down. I also might want to write down just these big words: tribalism, slavery, feudalism, capitalism. That the bourgeois is basically the middle class. And so he identified during feudalism that the bourgeois started to get upset. And we looked at that as we looked at the Middle Ages. We looked at the rise of towns, of middle classes coming together and forming these towns that lived separate from feudalism, that had elected mayors, that started to have democracy and science. And so he says that that class conflict created capitalism, where the bourgeois, that middle class, took over a lot of the power because they started making factories and making money, and they started becoming more and more important in running society. So Marx said that's what it is today, but he identified the next class conflict. Because what a lot of historians do is they look at what happened in the past and see if it'll predict the future. And so he said there's this group called the proletariat, which I'd want to write down. Proletariat basically means workers who are going to be upset. As we looked at, they're being taken advantage, they're living in these slums. So there's going to be a class conflict. And so there's going to be a new way of organizing businesses and society. And he called that either whatever you want to call it, Marxism, socialism, communism, as a way in which the workers would control everything, not the middle class, not the upper classes. There wouldn't be slavery. There was this kind of upward trend of more and more people holding power. So this is a very popular message among people, including a guy named Vladimir Lenin, who we're going to learn about in a second, because that's where we're going. All right. Before we get to there, we have to talk a little bit about Russia. These are some other words I want to write down. They're red. Russia had kind of a very strongly feudal system still. You had the Tsar. We've talked about the Tsars before. They're these leaders with absolute power. It's an absolute monarchy. They see themselves as part of a religious structure. Because they have all this power and they see themselves as God's anointed, they're really not going to be someone who's going to say, well, let's try to take care of the people underneath me. They're mostly concerned with keeping their power. And that's a problem in Russia because you get a lot of people who are super upset, and those are the serfs. So serfs are basically peasants, but they're mostly slaves. They had almost no rights. They couldn't leave the land. They were forced to work for whatever landowner they were born to. They could be transferred to other ones and basically sold. All of that happened until 1861, when one of the Tsars, noticing that the serfs kept revolting about this status. It's really amazing when you look at Russian history how often the serfs would revolt, be crushed by the Tsar, and still keep going because they were just on the edge of starvation. There's really no reason not to keep revolting if you're going to die anyway. But even when they got their freedom, they really didn't have freedom. They had to pay the Tsar for the land that they did. They often had then defaulted on the land. They weren't able to pay for it. So the Tsar would take it back, sell it to another serf, who of course wouldn't be able to pay for it. So the Tsars really kept control in every way. But this kind of pattern in which the Tsars used military force to keep the serfs in line started to run into problem because you started to get what are called urban workers. And that's because the Industrial Revolution, which we talked about, hit Russia late in the 1880s. And it started to mean that peasants moved to cities because they didn't have as many jobs working in agriculture. And so they started living in these terrible factories and working, once again, a lot of cheap labor. But there are some things that happen that don't work for the Tsar. The Tsar can control the serfs pretty well. They're scattered all over the land. But urban workers are condensed. And when you're condensed, you start to talk. You think about those rooms we looked at. There's 20 people living in a room. Those people are going to begin to talk. They're going to begin to complain about what's happening. If I locked all you guys in my classroom, you guys would start talking about all the ways in which I'm awful and begin to organize and maybe overthrow me. So putting everybody together became a bad thing because they started forming Soviets. So we think of Soviet, we think of the Soviet Union, but basically Soviets were unions. They're local worker councils that are working together to agitate for rights, to make sure that they're going to get better factory conditions, that they're going to get a better place to live, that they're going to be paid more, that they're going to get days off, that they're going to be treated better. All right, so Russia has these kind of tensions that are simmering under the surface, and then World War I happens. Russia jumps in, like most of the other powers, thinking that it's going to get more land. It thinks one of the ways to keep these peasants and workers happy, and the nobles, is to take a bunch of land off Germany and Austria-Hungary and take the resources and try to keep society reformed and making it better. But Russia has trouble because Russia is not as advanced as Germany or Austria-Hungary, and they lose badly. So, 3 reasons for the Russian Revolution, which I'd want to write down. They had no food or fuel. They were not prepared for war. When you have war, you have 2 million, 3 million, 4 million soldiers on the line. Well, when we're talking about World War I, and you need to be able to feed them, and Russia just couldn't do it. So there started to be shortages back home. They also didn't have enough wood in order to burn for fuel, so people were cold, which in Russia is a bad thing, especially in the winter. They also just kept losing World War I battles, and they kept sacrificing soldiers. They had an old way of doing war, which is to just charge at things, so the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians did pretty well in just having them charge machine guns and killing them. And that's part of it, kind of ties in that third one, which is bad leadership by the Tsar. Tsar Nicholas had a concept that he was a military genius, even though he had no actual military talent. So he led the armies themselves and did poorly, which made people not like him. All right, so all of this sets the stage for the Russian Revolution. What I want you to do in a sec here is pause the video and work through that document, Russian Revolutionary Primary Sources. When you get to the questions about a video, you can stop on that document, come back here, I'll play the video, and then we'll have just a few short things to talk about with the video, and then we'll be done. So pause here. All right, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed those primary sources. Those are people who are talking about their experiences of going through this. But right now, I want to show you a quick 3-minute video
So go to Wix.com. What are you
about
waiting for? Today's the day.
the Russian Revolution.
What I'm going to do in this class is use the lessons of history to apply to your daily life.
The Russian Revolution. The year is 1914. World War I had begun, and Russia was at war with Germany. The working class and the peasants make up the Russian army. However, they are not well equipped or trained for the battles to come. The year is now 1917. Millions of Russians had been either killed or wounded. The Russian people were angry at Tsar Nicholas II for getting Russia into the war, and several other reasons, including the Tsar taking personal command of the army, Rasputin's power over the royal family, food shortages, and growing political opposition. The first revolution came about in February 1917 on the Julian calendar. In Petrograd, which was the capital of Imperial Russia, demonstrators protested about the lack of bread due to rationing and were soon joined by striking workers. The army was called upon to suppress the uprising. Several protesters were shot and killed by the soldiers. However, many refused to open fire. The army, too, it seemed, had mutinied against the Tsar. The Petrograd Soviet was the city council for workers and soldiers. Now, more and more workers and soldiers elected people to it in order to represent their demands. The Tsar abdicated, bringing an end to the Tsarist autocracy, and a new government took over. This government was run by two political parties, the Petrograd Soviet and the Provisional Government. The Bolshevik Revolution. The Provisional Government was also unpopular. It made the decision to remain in the war and failed to give land to the peasants. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks were a faction of the Marxist Russian Social Democratic Labor Party and eventually became the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. He had a simple slogan which would appeal to the people and the Petrograd Soviet: peace, bread, and land. Peace, the end of Russia's involvement in World War I. Bread, solving food shortages. And land, which would go to the peasants. He also stated all power to the Soviets, meaning that he would seize power in the name of the Soviet. On November 6 and 7, 1917, or October 24 and 25 on the Julian calendar, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, launched a coup d'etat against the Provisional Government. They stormed the Winter Palace and arrested the Provisional Government, putting themselves in charge of Russia's government. After the revolution, the Bolshevik government exited the war by signing a peace treaty with Germany called the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. A civil war would erupt in 1918 by those who were against the new Bolshevik government, the White Army, and the Bolsheviks themselves, the Red Army.
All right, so I'm going to go over this a little bit, but I wanted you to see that video. I enjoy the animation style. I think they do a good job with it. But we'll talk a little bit just to make sure we understand. You've now read some primary sources to kind of introduce what it was like. Then you've seen this video, and now we'll talk it through. So they talked about that February Revolution. People were upset they weren't being fed. They were losing this war. The Tsar seems like he doesn't know what's going on. And so they have this revolution in the streets. The military turns on the Tsar. They refuse to suppress the people, and the Tsar goes. So then they have this provisional government which is formed, and it's basically a democracy, but it's made up mostly of nobles in the middle class, who are the people who are educated and kind of poised to take charge of a government. So they put through some reforms that the Tsar wasn't willing to do, which is very welcome, but they make some mistakes. The biggest of one of which is they decide to keep Russia in World War I. They didn't want to be the people who came in and lost the war, so they kept them in there, even though Russia just keeps getting its butt kicked. One of the problems they have is because they're the nobles and middle class and not very well connected to the people, they come to depend on those Soviets, those worker councils, for support more and more often. And for a while that's okay, but it starts to turn on them. And a lot of that's because Lenin is around. So Lenin had been kicked out by the Tsar back in the early 1900s for agitating. And so he had been moved over to Germany, where Marx was from, and had been living there. So Germany, who are very smart, think to themselves, we want to get the Russians out of this war. One of the best ways would be to make sure that they have a lot of instability, and there's nobody who brings instability like Lenin and his crazy ideas about communism. So what they did is they put him on a train, but they were so afraid of his ideas that they might spread to German workers who were fairly equally oppressed. So they sealed the train, and so for 3 days he rode across Germany in this sealed train, which he wasn't allowed to get out of whenever it stopped to refuel or do anything, because they just didn't want his ideas to spread. When he gets to Russia, he gets off the train and is met by the people who are overjoyed to see this guy who had fought for them in the past back. And Lenin shows up with that German help, and he starts to make some kind of scary changes. He insists that the Soviets are the ones who get armed to keep the peace. He tells the provisional government, we need to protect you, and the workers are the people who can protect you. And the provisional government is so weak, and they depend on the Soviets, that they have to go along with it. After a little bit of this, he starts to criticize the government for the war, saying they're the ones who are losing this. They're doing the same thing as the Tsar. There's no difference between these nobles and middle class and the Tsar. He says basically what we need is class warfare. We need the lower classes to put down the nobles and the middle class and take charge. So a scant 6-7 months later, the Bolsheviks revolt violently. They get rid of the provisional government, they arrest them, and the Bolsheviks are in charge. The first thing they do, which is very smart but tough, is they sign a treaty with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Germany and Austria-Hungary want to go and attack France and have all these troops move over here, so they settle for just taking this large chunk of land away from Russia. So it's humiliating for Russia, but Lenin and his followers knew that they had to get Russia out of this war, which it had no chance of winning. So that's when you have the rise of the Soviet Union. It had to consolidate power, but now that it's not fighting the war, it can do that. The last thing I want to say about this is a fairly famous flag, which many of you have seen. It's the Soviet flag of the Soviet Union, and you can see the basis of its power here. The hammer and the sickle is what this is called. This hammer represents the workers, the industrial government, and then this represents the scythe, is something you use to cut down wheat that is grown in Russia. So that sickle or scythe is the other aspect of it. So it shows that Russia, represented by that star, is under the power of the peasants and the workers. All right, you guys are done for the day. Enjoy.